where does Charles Peter Wagner fit into all of this? Was he ever part of the Latter Rain movement?
Whenever I first examined Wagner and some of the cults that splintered from his branch of this part of American religion, I thought, well, this looks exactly like the message. And then when you peel back the theology, like you said, the theology is different. The framework is the same. But interestingly, the theology wasn't that different. It was very similar. There were just elements of the message morphed into the historical cult message, the legendary cult. It didn't match any of that because that postdated Wagner's affiliation. But Wagner is the person who coined the term the New Apostolic Reformation, and he gets credit for producing the framework, the foundation for the framework of the New Apostolic Reformation. However, as the research is now starting to indicate, he is just the person who coined the term, and he was riding a much bigger wave. He was heavily influential in that wave, but he was riding the wave that not only William Branham, but all of these others that the podcast we'll get into next season, he's riding this wave that was created by several different parties. And to say, was he in the Latter Rain movement, was he not? It's difficult because he was a missionary and he was out of the country for a good part of this. And then he came back and got involved with Fuller and the Fuller Seminary. He was very, very high ranking. He was a director, I believe, at the Fuller Seminary. Fuller worked, as we'll examine in the future, Fuller worked to some extent with William Branham. And William Branham even mentions working with Fuller and claiming that Fuller did not adopt the Latter Rain until he met with William Branham, and then they held some revivals together. So there's definitely some Latter Rain influence in the Fuller Seminary, and we know Wagner was a director in the Fuller Seminary. So I think it's safe to say that he was either directly influenced by the Latter Rain or he was one step removed influenced by the Latter Rain through Charles Fuller. My opinion is I think he was deeply influenced by Latter Rain.
Wagner is someone who's definitely worth a deeper look. I've spent some time looking into Wagner and some of the different things that he's published and wrote and taught. From what I can tell, from what I can gather, is he is definitely the guy who termed the phrase New Apostolic Reformation, and he did play an important role in the development of the idea of what New Apostolic Reformation is. But as far as I can tell, he was not part of the Latter Rain movement in its heyday in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. But coming into the 1970s, we can say for sure that he started to have some influence from people associated with Latter Rain as you come into the 1970s, for sure. Like you mentioned, when he became a professor and eventually director at Fuller Seminary, that started in 1971. And Fuller Seminary is in Los Angeles. And quite a few different Latter Rain people who had been influenced by Latter Rain became influential at that seminary. Charles Fuller himself, like you mentioned, who started that seminary, he actually died in 1968, so 3 years before Wagner joined the staff there. But Charles Fuller was a man who had worked not only with William Branham, he had also worked directly with Gerald Winrod, the Nazi, and directly with Roy Davis, the Klan leader. Okay, so Charles Fuller was right in there with those really radical-minded people. Now, Charles Fuller himself, I'm not saying he was a Nazi or white supremacist, but he was definitely working with Nazis and white supremacists. And it seems like, just like a lot like Angelus Temple, like we've mentioned, these guys come somehow into orbit of Angelus Temple, of Foursquare, of Fuller Seminary there, and there is an element of these Nazi-minded, white supremacist Klan-type figures hanging out in these places and having some level of influence. And, I think I don't at all think it's that way anymore. I don't think Fuller Seminary has Nazis or Klan figures there anymore. But as you go back, certainly before the 1950s, there was bona fide Nazis, there was bona fide Klan figures in those places. And anyways, when Wagner showed up there and became a professor, that was a lot closer to the point in time when those people were still around there. And here's actually a book that Wagner wrote. He wrote this in the 1970s after he had started working at Fuller. It's called Our Kind of People. And this book is essentially a polished up, well-wrote, cleverly worded justification for racial segregation of churches. That's what this is. It's a case for the racial segregation of churches in the modern era. And so he wrote that after he joined Fuller in the 70s. And so, again, that might give us a clue to what he was being influenced there at that time. Now, did he hold those views on to the end of the rest of his life? I don't know. I tend to think maybe not, but I don't know. But then as you come through the 1970s into the 1980s, that's when he comes into contact with John Wimber. So John Wimber is the key man who was behind the Vineyard movement. And John Wimber was also working with the Kansas City Prophets. And at that moment, Wagner also intersects with the Kansas City Prophets, who are at that point in time launching the third wave of Pentecostalism. And so Wagner was really in connection with the third wave of Pentecostalism from its inception. And he had actually somehow intersected with those guys before the second wave of Pentecostalism had ended. But anyways, as you come out of the third wave, Wagner becomes an important figure, and he helps produce the New Apostolic Reformation as you come out of the third wave of Pentecostalism.